hoping to fill in some of the gaps that Susan discussed yesterday in terms of talking about Ovid and also bringing more theory to the conversation. Ovid is often at the center of feminist scholarship exploring literary representations of sexualized violence in antiquity. Ovid's corpus is unique because of how thoroughly he writes about sexualized violence, a thoroughness which allows us to clearly discern patterns in his narratives of rape, especially in his epic The Metamorphoses and in his didactic poem The Fasti. In these narratives, Ovid often tells his audience of the victim's beauty. We learn of her resistance to rape through flight and other means. He displaces the action of the rape itself onto surrogate imagery or into other forms of violence, such as metamorphosis. Ovid as well provides intense focus on the punishment and torture the victims receive in the aftermath of their sexual abuse at the hands of goddesses and female members of their communities, particularly through metamorphosis and other forms of bodily change. While in Ovid, the acts of sexualized violence are brief and sometimes absurdly compressed, the poet generously depicts the aftershocks of their initial abuse and highlights the women responsible for this continuing trauma. Juno, for example, is associated with a long list of crimes against other women in the Metamorphoses and in the Fasti. The goddess enacts physical and psychological violence against Jupiter's rape victims through punitive transformation, displacement, silencing, and even death. Callisto, Semele, Latona, and many other divine and mortal women face her saeva era, her fierce anger. This era against Jupiter's victims and Juno's seeming unwillingness or incapacity to punish her husband dominate the Metamorphoses. Juno is not unique, however, as Diana and Minerva also participate in similarly violent behavior against victims of rape. Diana exiles Callisto from her band of nymphs for being raped by Jupiter, and Minerva punitively transforms Medusa for being raped in her temple by Neptune. These goddesses terrorize women in the wake of their rapes by gods, but never subject the gods to the same violence. Mortal women, too, are seen to participate in this violence and blame, such as when Clytie abets the murder of her sister Leucothoe, who is raped by Sol, and when Deianeira, the wife of Hercules, contemplates murdering Iole, his sexual slave. These misogynistic acts by women against other women who have been sexually abused are a well-established pattern in Ovid's representations of rape and manifest the phenomenon of sororophobia. Sororophobia, called internalized misogyny in psychological and sociological literatures, is a term coined by feminist scholar Helena Michie in her literary exploration of woman not as a unified category of identity, a category of sameness, but as a category of otherness fraught with differences, tensions, and hostilities. One of the most common and generative sources of difference between women surrounds perceived sexual transgressions. While sororophobia describes any act of violence, physical or psychological, that women commit against other women to enforce patriarchal oppression, I focus here on its use for policing female sexuality. At its root, sororophobia exists to benefit men, as the oppression of women cannot be maintained without the participation of both genders. Women in Ovid's corpus enact violent punishments against rape victims explicitly because they were sexually abused. Scholars such as Nagel, Janin, and McGauley have analyzed the characteristics and implications of female divine anger against other women in Ovid, but never used the framework of sororophobia. I argue that sororophobia can cast new light onto the role and motivations for such behavior. Ovid's exploration of sororophobia indicates that women are complicit in misogyny, but he never reveals its true source, patriarchy. Ovid's focus on sororophobia exists as a device to effectively exonerate male sexual abusers of blame for their violence. The poet luxuriates in the violent aftermath of rape through transformation or whatever sort of violence follows, but rarely shows us the violence of rape itself, as Richland, Mardner, and Siegel have demonstrated. This narrative choice displaces the violence of literal rape onto the subsequent transformation, and Ovid, by having so many female characters punitively transform or terrorize women, locates the blame for that violence in other women, rather than in the men who began it. The women's violence, in effect, becomes analogous to rape. Juno, in her transformation of the nymph Callisto into a bear, mutilates her body as Jupiter did previously when he raped her. Ovid does not show his audience Callisto's rape or Jupiter's violence, but does provide a thorough and graphic description of her transformation or Juno's violence. The story of Dryope in Metamorphoses Book 9 provides another example of Ovid's displacement of the male violence of rape onto sororophobic violence. In this episode, Dryope plucks a flower, which, unbeknownst to her, is the body of the nymph Lotus. As punishment for this disturbance, Lotus transforms Dryope into a poplar tree. Both Lotus and Dryope are victims of male aggression, as Lotus turned into said flower to escape Priapus's attempted rape, while Dryope was raped by Apollo. Ovid details how blood flows from Lotus when Dryope picks the flower, such that she figuratively completes the abuse of Lotus's virginity, symbolically reenacting the violence of Priapus. Dryope becomes a figurative rapist and an unwitting participant in sororophobic violence. Lotus, too, acts as a sororophobic agent in punishing a rape victim, one who has, by accident and by proxy, completed the intentions of her actual sexual abuser. While Lotus never punishes Priapus, she punishes Dryope as a proxy of him. The Dryope story demonstrates how the violence of men leads to violence among women, and how sororophobic violence eclipses the violence of the act of rape, which we, the audience, never see. Today, rather than emphasize the sororophobia of goddesses, I want to draw attention to two examples of mortal women blaming and punishing other mortals, as in the stories of Clytie and Deianeira. I also want to offer an analysis of a few representative examples of women resisting sororophobia, a rarer phenomenon in Ovid's text than of women participating in sororophobia. I will explore the story of Echo, a nymph famous for her vain pursuit of Narcissus, who loses her voice after she helps other nymphs escape Juno's violence. The story of Procne, who supports her sister Philomela after she is raped by her husband Tereus. And of Lara, the water nymph who defends her sister Juturna from Jupiter's sexual aggression. I begin with the story of Clytie and Leucothoe from Metamorphoses, Book 4. Clytie commits sororophobia in the most literal fashion after her sister, Leucothoe, is raped by the god Sol. The god formerly had a sexual relationship with Clytie, which Ovid never defines as non-consensual, although the power dynamics between the mortal Clytie and the god suggests otherwise. When Clytie discovers Sol's rape of her sister, she becomes beside herself with jealousy and decides to take revenge against her sister. Clytie assumes the persecuting role typical of Juno in Ovid, even adopting the language the goddess uses against her sexual rivals, calling Leucothoe Pylex, or slut, in Metamorphoses Book 4, line 234. Clytie approaches their father, who in his patriarchal rage over the loss of Leucothoe's virginity, buries her alive. Clytie here very clearly participates in the policing of another woman's sexuality and has betrayed her sister to the violent mandates of patriarchal power. Leucothoe, before the burial, reminds her sister and her father that she was raped by Sol. Ille vim tulit invitae. That man raped me against my will. Metamorphoses Book 4, lines 238 to 239. But such a reminder is to no avail. As Janet observes, neither father nor sister consider her lack of consent. Instead, the lethal violence they enact against Leucothoe becomes Ovid's surrogate for the violence of rape. Sol does nothing to protect his rape victim from the burial, but transforms her into frankincense before she dies as a late attempt at salvation, which further carries the story away from his unseen act of sexual violence against Leucothoe. The god furthermore abandons Clytie, who in her madness over his sexual rejection transforms into a heliotrope. In another account of mortal sororophobia, Deianeira, in both Heroides 9, one of Ovid's erotic epistolary poems, and in Metamorphoses Book 9, blames Hercules' prisoner Iole for Iole's rape by her husband. Deianeira, like Juno and Clytie before her, condemns Iole as a Pylex in Metamorphoses Book 9, line 144. In the Heroides, fantasizing about Iole, whom she has not yet met, Deianeira believes that Iole gloats about the sexual power she has over Hercules. She imagines that Iole is far from a sexual captive at all. Her hair is not disordered, her eyes are not downcast. Deianeira has no sympathy for Iole, whom she does not view as a sexual captive, but instead as an adulteress who has stolen her husband. Metamorphoses Book 9 displays a more intense state of desperation than in the Heroides, with Deianeira wondering if she should act murderously like her brother Meleager when his lover Atalanta was dishonored and slit the throat of Iole. Deianeira's sororophobia fortunately only amounts to fantasized violence against Iole. In the end, Deianeira instead focuses on regaining Hercules' love, unintentionally killing him with the poison cloth the centaur Nessus falsely told her would help her maintain Hercules' love. She commits suicide after Hercules' death, while Iole lives, impregnated later by Deianeira's and Hercules' son. Just as Clytie's enforcement of patriarchy's arbitrarily violent punishment of female sexuality does nothing to end her suffering, Deianeira's sororophobic fantasies lead only to the death of her husband and her own suicide. Juno, the most prominent Ovidian sororophobic agent, similarly achieves little through sororophobia. She commits violence against other women in the hope that Jupiter will learn his lesson, but in vain. His desire for other women is bottomless, and her revenge does not restore her honor. Several of Ovid's rape narratives deviate from the script of women facing violence at the hands of other women. In these stories, women refuse to enact misogynistic mandates, instead supporting other women and working to resist male violence. But Ovid's texts punish these women for such acts of resistance and ultimately delegitimize the motives and means for such solidarity between female characters. In Ovid's universe, this bravery and compassion is never rewarded or even condoned. Richland comments that one of the most disturbing aspects of Ovid's representations of rape is this very refusal to see protective sisterhood go unpunished. It must also be reiterated that even sororophobic women, such as Clytie, do not escape unscathed, their contributions to the maintenance of patriarchy insufficient to protect them from violence. In this section of my paper, I will discuss the resistance Echo, Philomela and Procne, and Lara display against male power and tropes of sororophobic violence and how they suffer immensely for it. The story of Echo and Narcissus in Metamorphoses Book 3 receives wide scholarly attention for his offerings on the nature of desire, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and more. Echo's background story, however, is also deeply connected to Ovid's representations of sororophobia. Juno destroys Echo's powers of independent speech after learning that Echo prevented her from catching nymphs who were sexually involved with Jupiter. Admittedly, Echo's motives for helping the nymphs flee Juno is unclear. Is she abetting Jupiter in committing rape, protecting nymphs from Juno's savage punishment, or both? Does she become complicit in Jupiter's rapes in order to avert Juno's possibly more violent revenge? Later, Echo takes on the characteristics of male sexual abusers hunting and stalking Narcissus. But whatever her motives and subsequent actions, Echo is brutally silenced and suffers for protecting fellow nymphs from Juno's violence. The nymph stops acts of sororophobia from Juno only to experience one herself. In the story of Procne and Philomela, Procne rejects the violent sexual jealousy Ovid has led us to expect from women in the Metamorphoses. When Procne learns that her husband Tereus has mutilated and repeatedly raped her sister Philomela, Procne supports Philomela, choosing her sister over both her husband and her son Idas. She and Philomela together concoct a revenge plot which involves slaughtering Idas and serving him for dinner to Tereus. At first, Procne struggles with nemia pietas, too much pietas. Does she make herself loyal to her sister or to her son? Eventually, Procne decides that choosing Tereus and thus Idas would be a nephos in itself, nephos being a major motif in the story because of its emphasis on speech, silencing, and crime. Ovid's text, however, condemns Procne's support of Philomela because of the violent revenge that support embraces. Ovid fundamentally delegitimizes the sisters' revenge plot by analogizing their vengeance against Tereus and violence against Idas to Tereus' earlier mutilation and rapes of Philomela. As a result of these similarities and reciprocities, Procne and Philomela quickly lose whatever moral high ground they had over Tereus, and their sisterhood and resistance grow abhorrent to the audience. Ovid equates the two transgressions by describing both Tereus' rape and the sisters' slaughter of Idas with the word nephos. Each actor, for example, rejoices in committing nephos. In another example of equivalence, when Tereus consumes his son, his mouth becomes a sexualized orifice penetrated by a family member against his will, just as Tereus forcibly penetrated Philomela. The sisters, in the end, achieve reciprocal vengeance for the rapes and mutilation of Philomela, committing mimetic violence through the slaughter of Idas. They subject Tereus to the same torture Philomela felt when he raped her repeatedly and severed her tongue after she condemned him, but in a way that Ovid's text does not celebrate. Finally, Ovid reinforces the equivalence between Tereus and Philomela and Procne when they all transform into birds, a visual symbol of their equivalence. The text continually asks if Procne and Philomela were justified in their revenge and their anti-sororophobia mission. The answer, because of these many symmetries with Tereus and his brutalities against women, appears to be a resounding no. I will end my discussion of women resisting male violence and refusing to participate in sororophobia with the story of Lara and Juturna from the Fasti Book 2. When Jupiter's pursuit and stalking of the nymph Juturna is unsuccessful, the king of the gods turns to her sister nymphs to help him fulfill his desire for Juturna. They agree to help him, this decision making an interesting comment on the complicity of women in sexualized violence, and of course, how women protect themselves from it, and the impossibility of resisting greater powers. Does their consent to his plot really amount to consent at all, since Jupiter has so much power over them? When Jupiter believes the moment has finally come to capture Juturna, one of the nymphs who previously seemed to agree with the rest, Lara, tells Juturna to run and informs on Jupiter to Juno, displaying a spirit of sisterhood to both Juturna and Juno. Jupiter, enraged at her meddling, rips out Lara's tongue, and soon afterwards Mercury rapes her brutally. In this story, Lara refuses to take part in Jupiter's violence and once again faces grave consequences for her conviction. Lara's story is intimately connected to those of Procne and Philomela and Echo, which all feature rape, silencing, resistance to male power, and sororophobia. First, Lara's protection of her sister evokes the figure of Procne, who, as we have seen, faces punishment for prioritizing her blood bonds to Philomela over her marriage bonds to Tereus. Lara's story, however, is most obviously similar to that of Procne and Philomela because of the oral mutilation she experiences for opposing male violence. The mutilations of Philomela and Lara remind the audience of the futility of vocal resistance to rape. Lara's story also mirrors that of Echo, who defied Juno with her speech and so loses her ability to speak independently as punishment. But unlike Lara, it is possible that Echo was complicit with Jupiter, abetting his amatory ambitions with nymphs, ensuring that he was not disturbed by Juno's prying eyes. It is also entirely possible that Echo, as we considered earlier, wanted to ensure the safety of her sister nymphs from Juno's wrath, even if she could not ensure their safety from Jupiter. How do lesser immortals accommodate the power of Olympians for their own protection and survival? Who is worse, Jupiter or Juno? Readers in this story might expect Juno's famous wrath turned against Juturna as a pilex of Jupiter, as in the story of Echo. While sororophobic violence has become ingrained in Ovid's representations of rape and its aftermath, in these episodes, Ovid instead focuses on the lasting negative consequences of female solidarity, a preeminent issue for Echo, Philomela, and Procne, and Lara. Not one woman in Ovid resists male power or sororophobic mandates without also facing painful and violent ramifications. In conclusion, I have argued that Ovid's representations of the aftermath of rape depict the phenomenon of sororophobia. Ovid centers the punishment women receive from other women in the wake of sexual abuse as some of the most prominent acts of violence in his text. The sororophobic violence these women commit mirrors, reenacts, and eclipses the male violence of rape that we, as an audience, do not see. This technique displaces the blame for violence onto women, exonerating men of the responsibility for rape. I have also analyzed how women who refuse to comply with sororophobia are punished by Ovid's male and female characters and by his narrators. Very few women engage in such resistance, and those who do suffer for their solidarity. Both sororophobia itself and the punishment of women who refuse to commit it illustrate that misogynistic violence is pervasive in Ovid's text, leaving women with little means of escape, hope, or solace. Thank you.